as a communist, how do you reconcile that with views on religion? Because,
Hmm.
some people would say that we've lost our moral compass because fewer people go to church now, where I think if you're, uh, approaching things from your perspective, you must have a totally different take on that, where religion maybe is sort of out of the equation. Am I correct in that?
Well, actually, no. I would
Godless communism.
Right.
What
I
the
would
heck
say
is
that it took me a long time to realize this, right? When I was a
Yeah.
teenager, I was very much a rebel and I got into atheism and such, but it took me a long time. It took me going to Iran and traveling around the world to realize I never would have even thought about becoming a communist if it hadn't been for the fact that I was taught from a very young age that one should live for the sake of others, and that Jesus Christ died on the cross for my sins. I am a Christian. I am a Christian deep down. I had a college professor, in college, I would be talking to him about communism, and he'd always say, "You sound like a Christian, Caleb. You sound like you're preaching Christianity to me." And I didn't understand what he was saying, but it took me years to kind of realize that. And that it's interesting. Friedrich Nietzsche, who's one of these new age postmodern thinkers that gets pushed in the universities, his argument against communism, he said, communism is nothing but Christianity. It's just dressed up. It's Christianity dressed up to be modern and scientific, but it's the same thing that Jesus was pushing. The last shall be first, the first shall be last, sacrifice for what is right, build God's kingdom on earth, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to get into heaven. If you read, the book of Acts, it talks about how the disciples held all things in common and none among them were in want, and all, shared what they had, sold their possessions. And I mean, if you read it, Jesus was building some kind of
Jesus was a
revolutionary
socialist.
movement. Yeah, absolutely.
You made an excellent argument on Christmas Day. I remember you did a special called Jesus Was a Socialist. And I encourage people, if you're curious, to go to Caleb's YouTube channel and look for that video called Jesus Was a Socialist. Makes a really strong case for that.
I would argue that the reason communism was so anti-Christian in its beginning years and in the 20th century was because in a feudal society, religion is not an option, right? In feudalism, the king has divine right to rule over you. He's appointed by God. If you disagree with the church, you get burned at the stake. Peasants are told, well, you were meant to be a peasant. God put you here, be a good peasant, or else you're going to go to hell. Don't rebel, don't question anything. And that communism came out really out of the struggle to bring down feudalism. It was after feudalism had been brought down in Germany and France and other places. People realized there was still a lot of injustice. And so the beginning of the communist movement was kind of disappointment with the revolutions that brought down feudalism. But it was still coming out of that struggle to overturn feudalism. And in Russia, at the time of the revolution, the Tsar, he wasn't just the king, he was also the Pope. He was the head of the church, right? And they saw the church as this institution that propped up the oppression of the peasantry and all of that. And in China, there were similar things. It wasn't just Mao, but even Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the founder of modern China, the first thing he did, his first revolutionary act, he was like 21 years old, is there was a temple where these peasants were being made to bow before statues. And he went into the temple and he smashed the statues and he said, don't do this. This is degrading. We need science. We need modern ways of doing things. So in the struggle to bring down feudalism, the idea that religion is this tool that's used to oppress people. It's a tool used to oppress people. It makes perfect sense. And that's why Marx was always saying that his socialism was scientific rather than utopian or religious. That was the thrust. But now we live in a very different period. We live in a very different time where religion is an option, right? No one's making you be religious. And I would argue that at this point, atheism and anti-moralism and what they call philosophical irrationalism is the religion of the ruling class. That's what Netflix is preaching at us. That's what they're preaching in the universities.
Very true.
They want us to believe that right and wrong doesn't exist. You have no obligation to anyone else, no obligation to society, no obligation to your community. You're an atomized individual, rational, self-interest, greed is good. Everyone's on their own. Everyone can just do whatever they want. It's just the law of the jungle. Everyone's out there struggling against everyone else. That's what they believe, right? And that's what they're pushing. And I would argue that in the communist world, and that's the other thing, is in the communist world now things have changed. For example, the head of the Russian Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, I've met him. I actually met him when I was in Russia in 2018 to cover their elections. I was embedded with his campaign. He is a really strong Christian. He's a really strong Orthodox Christian. Nicaragua, I've been to Nicaragua. I met the son of the president, the son of Daniel Ortega. And, you know, the slogan that is painted all over the walls in Nicaragua is Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. That's where they're preaching things. So things have flipped, I would argue. Now, China is still very much an atheistic country. North Korea is very, very atheistic. Vietnam is the same way. But even in the countries where it's still a prevailing atheistic ideology, you know, China has realized they really badly treated Roman Catholics and Buddhists and Muslims. And there's been a huge flip in the way they treat people of religious faith. And there's been a huge amount of apologizing for what went on in the 1970s when, you know, they were forcing Catholic priests and nuns to get married. And if they didn't get married, they were saying, oh, well, Mao wants to increase the population. You're not getting married and having children. So that's counter-revolutionary and you went to jail or something. They realized that was wrong. That was completely wrong. They should never have acted that way. You know, they destroyed during the Cultural Revolution a lot of the ancient temples that were, you know, religious sites that were kind of part of China's national history. And they realized that was devastating. They lost their own heritage by doing that. So there has been kind of a flip, even in the countries that it is still atheistic in their communism. They realize that religion is very much part of their identity. You know, Syria, the government there, it's not the Communist Party that's the ruling party. The Communist Party is part of the ruling coalition, but the ruling party is the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. And in Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, it was the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. Gaddafi, it was Islamic socialism. And in the Arab world, there was a feeling that the only type of socialism they could ever have was a socialism that recognized the important place of Islam in the Arab culture, which I think is very fascinating, right? That the founder of Baathism in Syria he was from a Christian family and he was a communist atheist, but he realized when they were trying to develop a form of socialism for Syria and for Iraq and for Libya and for Egypt and other Arab countries, that the only way it was going to work is if it was an Islamic form of socialism. And I strongly believe we should have separation of church and state. I'm not an advocate of any kind of theocracy. I am a Christian, but I do believe that socialism in the United States will be very Christian in the way it's promoted. It'll probably, there'll be room for Muslims and Jews and Hindus. There'll be room for atheists and others. But I think that when socialism does eventually come to the United States, it'll have a very, very Christian overtone to it, like the socialism in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, they have Christianity and socialism in their constitution. It says, we follow Christ's message and believing that God's children should all have health care and jobs. And it's like in the preamble of their constitution.
Wow. We don't even have anything like that in our founding documents, really.
Right. So, I think things have largely changed. That's what I would argue. And that obviously, the horrendous things that were done to Christians in the 20th century in communist countries, that's something that we just need to admit happened. And we need to say it was wrong. I mean, there's no way around it. We need to say it was wrong. And there have been mistakes with Muslims in China, with Tibetan Buddhists. There have been mistakes all around. And I think things have just changed in the past few years.
I find it interesting and inspiring in a way that the communism of the 20th century has evolved into 21st century communism. And unlike our system over here, the communist countries realize where they went wrong. They admit they made mistakes and they corrected them, which is something that we in America never do. I mean, we double down on stupid. We never correct a mistake. It practically takes an act of God to get us to admit we made a mistake.
Yeah, it's weird, right? For a long time, it was that America had never done anything wrong. It's, if you don't like it here, love it or leave it. But now I feel like it's almost, now they're doing even the opposite of that with the wokeness. Now it's almost like, the 1619 Project is historically inaccurate. It's false, right? The United States was not founded to preserve slavery. Slavery went on and it was horrendous. But the United States, the founding of the United States, Alexander Hamilton was supporting the Haitian Revolution and he was against slavery and a lot of the founding fathers, there was a divide, right? And that there are things in America that we can be proud of. And the woke current, the synthetic left, the 1619 Project, all of that, they want us to think that all of American history was nothing but slave plantations and genocide. But while all the evil things were going on in American history, You had people like John Brown that were leading revolts and standing up against slavery. You had Harriet Tubman. You had Frederick Douglass. You had the labor movement. You had the suffragists fighting for the rights of women. You had Eugene Debs, who gave an anti-war speech and was thrown in federal prison for doing so. You know, during the Vietnam War, when the USA was killing millions of people in Vietnam, you had so many brave young men, thousands of them, who burned their draft cards and said, I'm not going to go to Vietnam, and went to prison rather than fight in Vietnam. And that all gets glossed over. And the synthetic left, on the, you know, they want us to just hand over the entire history of the United States to Donald Trump. They want us to just hand over the entire history of what it means to be an American to conservatives. And the only way you can be left wing or progressive is to just enter this space and say, yeah, America's evil, burn it down, tear it down, flog yourself. And, you know, oh, we're not. And I say we don't have to do that. We can be proud of our heritage as Americans, of the good things. And we can show that the bad things, they weren't done because Americans are just evil and racist deep down. They were done because of capitalism. They were done because the big corporations and the banks and the big monopolies that want to, you know, conquer the world. And, the Vietnam War, 58,000 young men were sent to die in Vietnam. Why? For the profits of big corporations, to stop Vietnam from breaking free and developing. And that wasn't good for America. That wasn't good. You know, I have a cousin who I never met. He's on the Vietnam Wall. His name's on the wall in Washington, D.C. Was that good for my family that he went to Indochina and got shot? Of course not. That's not.
And the
good
whole
for
reason
America.
that we were told we did that was to stop the domino effect, to stop communism from spreading. And then Korea and Vietnam, you know, we lost that war. The communists won.
Yeah.
So it was all for nothing.